From here, a violent wind sweeps across the frozen plain.
Just another human being full of quirks, little foibles.
It's the darkness that's got you down. Nobody ever feels really safe in the dark.
I think the Emperor is the loneliest boy on earth.
There once was a city, long ago, nestled upon the banks of the river Euphrates, surrounded by a fathomless moat and fortified on all sides by mountains of brick, its parapets reaching far into the heavens themselves. The tremendous gates of bronze which encircled it, guarded by lions made of stone and dragons of gold. Feared by those it opposed, exalted by those it protected, and coveted by every heart in the world who came to know its beauty. The first mention of the city's existence was long before this eventual grandeur, in the 3rd millennium BCE, by the Akkadian king Shar-Kali-Shari, ruminating on his construction of 2 temple foundations within its grounds. At that time, nothing more than another settlement in a vast empire which he ruled. And then it disappeared, not to be mentioned again for another 400 years, long after the collapse of Akkad, when an Amorite by the name of Sumu-Abum would liberate the city from a neighboring tyrant's rule, founding the first of 2 dynasties that would owe the city its name. It was Sumu-Abum and his son Sumu-La'el who erected the first of its great walls, and from then on, tales of its grandeur never escaped the histories of our world again. As the city grew, so too did the luster of its coffers and the reach of its power. And for the next 2,000 years, it would be seized, raised, and seized again by every corner of the world who'd heard tell of it. The Hittites, the Kassites, the Elamites, the Assyrians, the Aramaeans, the Suchians, the Chaldeans, the Persians, the Macedonians, even Trajan of Rome couldn't resist trying to steal what was once the most illustrious city in the world. In Hebrew, it was known as Babel, meaning to confuse, the inglorious capital in the books of Genesis, Daniel, and Jeremiah. To the Akkadians, it was Bab Ilani, the gate of the gods. And to the Greeks, and to us, it's simply known as Babylon. The most beloved of all of its many crowned kings, Nebuchadnezzar the Great. See, of the many things for which Nebuchadnezzar is remembered, the city's towering edifices of brick and of stone are undoubtedly the most ubiquitous. Because in Babylon, a king wasn't just a ruler, a wager of war, or a levier of taxes, he was a custodian unto the city itself. Every Babylonian king was expected to not only construct great works within its walls, but to restore and exalt the many works left behind by those who had come before. So when Nebuchadnezzar ascended his throne, he took up the charge of expanding and rebuilding the city's then waning splendor, raising it up to the greatest heights it would ever reach. And most of the poetic and artistic interpretations of it that we know today are based on how it appeared during the 43 years of his reign. The Greek historian Herodotus, who wrote of it some 2 centuries after Nebuchadnezzar had ruled, declared that Babylon's wonder far surpassed any other city on Earth. Its vast walls stretched 60 miles around, 80 feet thick in tiers of 2, tearing 300 feet into the sky above the sands below. The Ishtar Gate leading into its inner districts, a shimmering arc of blue stood 50 feet tall, emblazoned with bulls and terrifying dragons painted with gold. The Lion of Babylon, carved from black basalt, stood ever vigilant over the great city, a goddess saddled upon its back, and a cowering human to symbolize their enemies, chiseled beneath its triumphant feet. The Temple of Belus, the Tower of Babel, poised next to the river's brim, soaring nearly as close to the sun as the Great Pyramid itself. Herodotus may have been prone to a bit of idyllic exaggeration from time to time, but even in the twilight of its glory by the age he had seen it, even if the numbers are all wrong, it must have been breathtaking. But Nebuchadnezzar the Great and the other keepers of the City of Gold understood something few kings ever really seemed to grasp. Nothing lasts forever. Where the great city once stood by the 10th century AD, nothing more than a small village remained, noted by local writers of the time not as a seat of power or a venerable monument to the gods, but as a source of spare bricks, stamped with a strange seal they couldn't recognize, laying in the dunes to be taken away and used to create Babylons of their own. The colossal foundations of the past hidden just beneath their feet. So Nebuchadnezzar left something behind, something time couldn't erase. Beneath the ruins, beneath the sands of the very statues and temples once built in his name had been reduced to, he buried letters, Cylinders of clay inscribed in cuneiform, fired in the great kilns to preserve them as best they could and addressed to anyone willing to read them. To the gods, to future kings, to whoever was inquisitive enough to find them. If nothing else should remain, know that Nebuchadnezzar the Great was here, in the kingdom of Babylon, the greatest city that the world has ever known. Which begs the question, if at the end of all things, our fate is to simply collapse and fall back into the sea, no matter how great our works, then what do our works really mean? Anyways, that's what I'm gonna spend the next however long I feel like talking cool about, so put on your thinking caps and strap in. I'm really smart, and this is Lupin the Third, the Castle of Cagliostro, and what legacy means.
I'm so glad that I found you. I'm gonna build my whole world around you. I'm gonna be good, so good to you, lady. Yeah, 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 yeah. Why don't you let me be the one to take care of you?
You know, this reminds me of a picture I saw once.
Stay with me.
All right, before we get to talk about the Castle of Cagliostro itself, we first have to answer a surprisingly difficult question. What and who exactly is Lupin the Third? Lupin the Third is a character created by Kazuhiko Kato as the protagonist of his manga by the same name, written under Kato's now esteemed pseudonym Monkey Punch, originally released in Weekly Manga Action in 1967. According to an interview he did in 2003, though, he actually never liked the name Monkey Punch that much, so for the rest of the vid, and out of respect for Mr. Kato, I'm gonna be using his real ID instead.
Thank you, BREADSWORD, for keeping it 100.
Don't mention it, big guy. The original Lupin the Third manga was effectively a self-insert fanfic of James Bond drawn in the style of Mort Drucker from Mad Magazine, except in Kato's version of the world, 007 wasn't a servant to the powers that be, but a brazen thief who's almost constantly at odds with them. An endlessly charming swindler capable of doing anything he feels like, who is also inspired by, and even named after, French novelist Maurice Leblanc's tales following his iconic gentleman thief, Arsène Lupin. And since foreign copyright laws basically didn't exist at the time in Japan, Mr. Kato decided not just to name his OC after him, but to literally write it into the manga itself that Lupin the Third was the grandson of Leblanc's very own clever crook. Eat your heart out, Wattpad. As opposed to Leblanc's styling of Arsène Lupin as more or less a lone wolf in the majority of his tales though, only consistently sharing the pages with Inspector Ganimard, the lead officer in charge of capturing him, Kato quickly drummed up an entire cast of enigmatic friends and foes who would accompany Lupin the Third throughout his adventures across our wide, wide world. And for my money, they're some of the greatest characters in the history of the medium. So let's meet them. Jigen Daisuke, Lupin's right-hand man and the gang's marksman, rumored to have a draw speed of 0.3 seconds and accuracy bordering on the superhuman, known to be a skillful getaway driver and able to detonate an incoming missile with a single shot from any caliber. Stoic, drip god, master thief. Goemon Ishikawa the 13th, their enemy-turned-companion, unparalleled swordsman wielding the legendary Zantetsuken, capable of cutting through virtually any material on Earth, can deflect bullets and frequently cuts the clothes and weapons off his adversaries to spare their lives. Friend to animals, zero bitches, master thief. Fujiko Mine, technically not a member of the gang, but Lupin's only true love. Reputedly the most beautiful woman in the world, capable of manipulating even the most cunning of minds, criminal or otherwise, including Lupin himself. Commonly betrays the trio to play both sides of a conflict and maximize her gains, but only puts him in situations they can handle and almost always helps them out of the ones they can't. Jazz pianist, assassin, girl boss, master thief. Inspector Koichi Zenigata, our detective Ganimard, also not part of the gang, but affectionately referred to as Pops or Old Man by them, an agent for Interpol specializing in the pursuit and capture of the world's greatest thief, Lupin the Third. Obsessed with catching the gang, but frequently outsmarted at the last second, and as often as he's found pursuing them, can also be found teaming up with them to defeat a greater evil. Skilled hand-to-hand combatant and wielder of numerous cuff-based gadgets which he builds, referred to affectionately in the English dub as Zenigachas, either in love with the thrill of the hunt or Lupin himself. Nobody knows for sure. Man of principles, lover of ramen, master detective. And finally, Lupin the Third, grandson of Lupin the First and the world's most wanted man, even though he's a hero. Carries an unassuming and playful demeanor masking unrivaled ability in virtually every facet imaginable. Master marksman, master assassin, master of disguise, master engineer, master pilot, master skydiver, master swimmer, master gymnast, master hacker, master spy, master driver, master of stealth, fluent in multiple languages including at least 2 dead ones, master archaeologist, master tactician, master artist, capable of transforming his voice and projecting it onto others at will, immune to numerous fatal toxins, master inventor, can smell a woman's scent through any disguise, master escape artist, master magician, master forger, master trickster, frequently noted for bearing a vague resemblance to monkeys. Only known weaknesses are women, his friends, and this octopus. Cannot be killed. History buff, playboy, pervert, romantic, gentleman, master thief. Except the versions of Lupin the Third and Co. that Kato originally created aren't quite the pernicious but amiable bunch of rogues that we know and love today. And that's because when Lupin the Third was finally picked up for adaptation by Tokyo Movie, aka TMS Entertainment, Mr. Kato realized that he wasn't quite cut out for the business of animation and left the pilot literally in the middle of production, not too long after drawing up its initial character sheets, putting the choice of who would lead the project in his stead up to the small team that he'd left behind. Enter Yasuo Otsuka. Yasuo Otsuka is a legend of Japanese animation. Some of the greatest sequences ever put to a cell in the 50s and 60s were wrought by his hands, like this scene from Horus Prince of the Sun where he struggles against a colossal fish, or the climactic final battle in The Little Prince and the Eight-Headed Dragon between Susanoo and the Hydra. Basically, this guy was goated at making pictures move with his hands, and is responsible for popularizing a lot of very common Western visual tropes and techniques in Japanese animation. And by the time Tokyo Movie decided to turn their Lupin pilot film into a Lupin pilot series, the only prominent people still left on the project were Yasuo Otsuka and his close Moomin collaborator Masaki Osumi. Osumi was assigned as the series' first director, and Otsuka was in charge of its character design and animation, as well as an unofficial role assisting with the scripts as he had helped write the original pilot. But it was immediately clear that Osumi's take on the series, much like Mr. Kato's himself, clashed dramatically with what the studio thought it could become. And after Osumi was asked to make changes to some of the material, following their first few episodes receiving atrociously low ratings, Osumi quit the production as well, leaving Otsuka alone to find a new director to take his place. And as luck would have it, there just so happened to be a young duo of animators who had mentored under Otsuka during their time at Toei and needed some new work after they'd followed him over to Tokyo Movie. The first 9 episodes of what would come to be known as Lupin the Third Part 1, or simply Green Jacket, are credited to Masaki Osumi as their director, but the following 14 mysteriously never credit one, because it wasn't actually one director, but 2 of them, working under Otsuka with an alias of their own, simply not being named at all. The duo, of course, were animation wonder boys Isao Takahata and Hayao Miyazaki.
Se você disser que eu desafino amor, saiba que isto em mim provoca imensa dor.
This entire first series is dissonant, to say the least, as it's a struggle between 2 fundamentally different visions for what Lupin the Third could be. On one hand, you have Osumi and Mr. Kato's extremely adult-themed, raunchy, no-holds-barred sort of style of action, which oftentimes boils down to Lupin and his gang just being actively bad people, sometimes straight up killing random bystanders or busting it down incel style about how much he hates feminism. And in general, this embryonic identity crisis, if you will, can be thought of as sort of the groundwork for the basic concepts of the series going forward. Kind of like how a lot of the early James Bond films feel like somebody just said, what if we gave a sociopath a ton of riz? I'd argue Lupin the Third, as it appears in the manga in these first 9 or so episodes, are an extremely earnest fulfillment of that prompt. And that's not an inherently bad thing either, because that edge is what initially grabbed people. And I still really love parts of the earliest stuff. It's just unrefined. And on the other hand of this directorial dichotomy, you have Otsuka, Takahata, and Miyazaki, rounding off some of the series' more sharpened points and countering many of its worst qualities by bringing in a much more optimistic and altogether warmer tone to its otherwise daunting and sometimes completely unfeeling world. And the result is something so deeply idiosyncratic, so obviously at odds with its own sense of identity and its perception of the universe around it, that it becomes remarkably human and really charming as a result. Part 1 saw an improvement in its ratings after the trio took the reins, but it wasn't nearly enough to right the ship, only rising to 9% in viewer share during its original broadcast. And the show ended as what anyone would call on paper an absolute disaster. But just like the death-defying exploits of the character himself, which surely would have been a fatal blow to any other series, actually offered Lupin the Third a lifeline few other productions could ever catch. The viewership was so low for Green Jacket that the studio who owned the broadcast rights started selling them to any station who was willing to air it, for pennies on the dollar, and the viewers who did catch an episode were astonished by its clash of violence and welcoming, likable characters, particularly in its latter 2/3, as up to this point, there'd never really been an anime produced for a young adult audience, so the requests to the stations kept piling in spite of its creator and its original director leaving in the midst of its production, in spite of 60% of it being directed by rookies who were only there on a vouch from Otsuka, and in spite of its initial release numbers sinking beneath the floorboards, Lupin the Third Part 1 went on to break records for the amount of orders put in by the broadcast industry to replay the show. And just like that, the legend of Lupin the Third, the animation, was born. But its defining works were still yet to come, and in 1977, Tokyo Movie followed up Part 1 with what many regard to be the greatest anime of all time, Lupin the Third Part 2, aka Red Jacket. It slaps so hard! Okay, Part 2 is the platonic ideal of an anime. Genuinely, it's flawless. It's 155 episodes long, they're all heaters, and two of its most iconic are directed by Hayao Miyazaki himself. I mean, seriously, Fullmetal Alchemist is cool or whatever, but when do they go to Mecca or kidnap a bunch of penguins to steal a crown? It manages to so perfectly balance the darker and more jovial elements of the world's tonality, while still developing the cast's extremely distinct personality traits along the way. And I don't think I've ever rewatched an anime as much as I have this one, unless we're counting a goofy movie, or as us real goofers call it, Shingeki Baka no Powerline. But perhaps most importantly of all, greater than its keen writing, its dexterous animation, or its fantastic voice acting, Lupin the Third Part 2 is where the world of Lupin found its soundtrack. A wholly unfair criticism of Part 1, but arguably its most glaring flaw in retrospect, is that it simply wasn't scored by the inimitable Yuji Ono, who's composed nearly every single piece of Lupin media following it, instead being scored by the still very talented in his own right, Takeo Yamashita. The music isn't expressly bad, per se, but it does have this unintentionally grating quality to it which exists in a lot of television scoring from the time, that worsens dramatically once you're used to the comparatively much clearer musical direction that accompanies Red Jacket and beyond. Going back and watching Part 1 after experiencing everything else in the canon is sort of the musical equivalent of watching Community after Troy leaves. It's not that it would be mid in a vacuum, but that it feels mid because you know what it's missing. Sick boy make moves like a chess piece. Part 2 isn't just where Lupin the Third started to put numbers up on the board, it's where the formula for animated Lupin was set, and its music was the final piece. In fact, it was so prolific that it still remains the most popular run of Lupin the Third today. Red Jacket was so beloved in Italy, they literally built the equivalent of a Disney store for Lupin in Milan, and a number of popular food spots throughout the country are actually named after the main characters, like Lupin and Margot, Fujiko's name in the Italian dub, or Zaza Ramen, named after Zenigata's. Lupin even passes by it in this episode of Part 4, The Italian Adventure, aka Blue Jacket. Anyways, with Part 2 doing solid in the ratings, TMS once again set their sights on producing a Lupin the Third feature film, except this time they'd be making a pair of them. One to capture each side of the series' inseparably intertwined aesthetic spectrum. The first of the two to be released, simply titled Lupin the Third and later renamed Lupin vs. the Clone, better known in the West as The Mystery of Mamo, was to be a much more concentrated and deliberate effort to honor the themes of Kato's original manga, without the conflicting creative visions of Part 1. Directed by Soji Yoshikawa and written by cult filmmaker Atsushi Yamatoya, best known for co-writing the new wave crime classic Branded to Kill. As you might expect, this film was incredibly dark by the industry standards at the time, barely skirting past censors and breaking a ton of conventions about what an anime film was allowed to be, and the result was nothing short of a masterpiece. It's insane. There's multiple hallucination sequences, Napoleon and Hitler show up at some point. During a fight, Goemon cuts through the frame of the movie itself. Its villain, Mamo, is like this ageless demigod super genius based on Paul Williams' character Swan from Phantom of the Paradise, but he looks like he could be one of the Espers from Akira. Come to think of it, Akira came out 9 years later and was produced by the same studio, and Lupin and Jigen do the Kaneda slide at one point, which I guess would make it the Lupin slide. What I'm trying to say here is that The Mystery of Mamo was an absolute banger that permanently shifted the course of the anime industry at large, and its success was a sign of the changing tides in Lupin the Third's favor, further propelling the series forward from rerun fodder to an esteemed A-list IP, and Japan was primed and ready for whatever was going to follow. And the very next year, TMS would deliver, with the second film of the pair and the single most famous work in the wide world of Lupin the Third. I'm speaking, of course, about the great, the incomparable, Lupin the Third, The Castle of Cagliostro. So let's talk about it. The film begins with a cold open, much like The Mystery of Mamo, except instead of Lupin being lowered into view by a noose cast against the same monochromatic backdrop he was born from, Cagliostro opens with Jigen and Lupin playfully rappelling through the frame before a palette of stormy blues, purples, and greens, before cutting away to reveal the Casino de Monte Carlo in Monaco, erupting out of the dark and filling the new world we're being introduced to with sound and light. We cut to a tracking shot of Lupin and Jigen leaping over hurdles in sync with the electric score of Yuji Ono now soaring in, as they flee the casino with its henchmen to their backs. The pair pulling away in their getaway car just in time for the guards to discover that theirs have all fallen apart, closing out with a zoom on Lupin's smiling face, crudely drawn and taped under one of their hoods. This film's introduction, to me, is maybe the tightest 120 seconds of filmmaking in animation. In its first 60, the part we just watched, Lupin and Jigen's context within their world, their demeanors, their expertise, and the film's own context within its canon are all expressed without a single word yet spoken. This is one of Cagliostro's strongest qualities throughout. It's extremely strong visual storytelling, and the following half of the sequence illustrates this perfectly. We open back up on Lupin and Jigen, now clearly illuminated by the morning sun, driving across a bridge in their getaway car smaller than anything else on the road, and filled to the absolute brim with money they had just stolen, laughing along as they filter through traffic and celebrate their score. But then something about the money catches Lupin's eye and his elation quickly fades. Jigen notices this, and brushing some money aside, matches the listless expression on his face, then switching to shock as he puzzles over a stack of bills in front of him, in response to whatever Lupin has said, before Lupin's expression changes in kind, first to one of determination and then to one of excitement, before they open the top of the car and begin throwing it all away. The humor returned to their faces as they exit frame left. This latter 60 seconds is entirely dedicated to exposition as to what the remainder of the film will be about. Goat bills, a type of legendary counterfeit and the mysterious origins to which they belong, which Lupin deems a challenge worthy of his talents. And the dialogue between the two throughout is wonderfully written and performed. You get an immediate sense of warmth and rapport from the pair, while at the same time illustrating the difference between their personalities and how they respond to the discovery. It's about as efficient and simultaneously seamless as an expository conversation at the beginning of an adventure can be, but what's especially remarkable about this is that you can gather all of its most crucial aspects without actually hearing or understanding a word of it. That's why we watched through it first before I told you what they were saying. Maybe you wouldn't have the minute details, but the characters in the castle of Cagliostro are animated with such depth and clarity to their expressions and movement that you can very readily follow its plot with absolutely no dialogue. And that's not hyperbole on my part either. That's literally how Cagliostro became popular in the West in the first place, long before it was ever localized here. John Lasseter, John Musker, Ron Clements, Kathleen Kennedy, Frank Marshall all sang its praises for a decade before its American theatrical debut in 1991. Kennedy even said specifically that Hayau's ability to render vivid imagery in service to a story was so similar to Spielberg's that her children used to watch The Castle of Cagliostro in Japanese with her often. John Lasseter attributed to the reason he married his wife. And even Steven Spielberg was long alleged to be a massive fan and even take some inspiration for his work with Indiana Jones. It was shown briefly in the US at a few science fiction conventions in the 80s, but only a few of those screenings were given rough subtracks from TMS, yet the film was met with almost universal acclaim anyways, even from people who couldn't understand a word of it, because you don't have to. Anyways, as we cut away from the bridge, our credits begin to roll. The film's opening theme, Fire Treasure, slowly rising into the aural foreground, washing away the sound of money as it's carried off into the distance by the wind. This is perhaps the most iconic piece of music in Lupin the Third, aside from the opening of Part 2, which nearly every subsequent theme for a series or film has been derived from. In fact, Fire Treasure is even referenced in a number of following works. In Green vs. Red, one of Lupin's impersonators listens to it in his truck on an iPod, and in Princess of the Breeze, a later track in the score is just a recomposed version of it called Treasure of Time. And I think a significant reason as to why that is that Miyazaki chooses to begin this film in the exact opposite way we're conditioned to think of themes and opening credits in relation to Lupin, even going back to Yamashita's score in Part 1. In the world of Lupin the Third, the credits are nearly always front-loaded and underscored by these bombastic, explosive themes to prime you for the action and adventure you're about to experience. But Miyazaki plays this in reverse, beginning the film with silence where there would normally be music, and then the shock of an alarm to break it, followed by a gentle love song accompanying a series of dreamy pillow shots of a road trip through the countryside, looking out to the sea and up at the stars as Toshikahara's mesmerizing voice serenades us over the longing strings, flutes, and harps of Yuji Ono. This theme and the visuals which accompany it aren't just significant because of their beauty, but because this entire sequence, from our first shots to the ending of these credits, is a speedrun and selling an audience that's likely never seen Lupin the Third on the unique energy that its universe is capable of producing. Not just in its electrifying peaks, but in the many tranquil valleys that lie between them. Particularly with Hayao Miyazaki at its helm, Cagliostro being the first film he'd ever direct. As the credits fade, we dissolve to a medieval bridge and an overgrown gate which reads Cagliostro, as Jigen and Lupin pull up in disguise and are ushered through by its kindly guards. Lupin explains that the place they've come to is the Duchy of Cagliostro, a remote and tiny kingdom, and the alleged source of the mysterious goat bills, at least according to legend. Interesting little language tidbit, by the way. In the original Japanese dialogue of the film, the counterfeits that the plot revolves around are called gotosatsu, which was originally written as Goto bills in TMS's first subtitled version of the film. So the original English dub of the film by Streamline Pictures misunderstood this and attributed the creation of the counterfeits themselves to a long-dead off-screen character named Goto. The anime's dub, which would come out later, as well as the subtitles based off of it, attempt to correct this, as Goto was presumed to be a transliteration for goat instead of using the Japanese word for it, Yagi, due to all the ram-related iconography throughout the film, hence goat bills. But Lupin also describes the inscription of an ancient ring later in the story as Gotomoji, meaning Gothic characters, as in the kingdom itself descends from the Goths. So few versions of the film's subs just cut it down the middle and call them Gothic bills instead, which also sounds suspiciously close to the punch cards they used to give out at Hot Topic. Yes, I will take 15% off my purchase of this Invader Zim t-shirt. Also, because of that silly little dismissal of foreign copyright law Mr. Kato did in the 1960s, when TMS finally tried to localize the castle of Cagliostro as the first Lupin film to hit the West, they ran into the teensy tiny problem of Maurice Leblanc's incredibly litigious estate never having signed off on his character being written into an anime as the grandfather of a character who can best be described as Bugs Bunny if he wore suits and was willing to die for a chance at getting pussy from a woman who constantly hurts him, which is, in fairness to Kato, the realest shit ever. The compromise, however, until Lupin the Third started making bank as a series and could pay off the estate, was a little awkward. See, in both the English dubs of the film, Lupin is referred to as Wolf, to avoid Leblanc's estate from suing them back into the Stone Age, which honestly is kind of lame, because if you know anything about Maurice Leblanc, the author himself, he would have absolutely loved Lupin the Third if he'd lived to see it. I mean, bro published a story in 1906 called The Extraordinary Life of Arsène Lupin, Sherlock Holmes Arrives Too Late, where his character literally just stunts on Sherlock Holmes in a game of wits, without ever asking Arthur Conan Doyle if he was allowed to, and when Doyle inevitably found out and threatened to take him to court for it, he published the same exact story again, with the character renamed to Herlock Sholmes just to fuck with him. Not to mention, Arsène Lupin wasn't an especially original character either. He's just a combination of Pierre-Alexis Ponceau de Terrail's adventure protagonist Rocambole and E.W. Horning's gentleman thief, A.J. Raffles. Oh, also, small nitpick, the English dubs changed Zenigata's first name from Keiichi to Keibu as well, and there's a part in the streamlined dub specifically where he introduces himself as Inspector Keibu Zenigata, but Keibu is the Japanese word for inspector, and it must have been written into the script as a misunderstanding, so in his first scene he just calls himself Inspector. I digress. The moment the pair pass through the kingdom's gate, the adventure is officially on, and Miyazaki kicks it off with what is arguably the greatest car chase sequence in cinematic history.
さて面白くなってきやがったまくるぞ
As Jigen and Lupin are driving through the countryside, they get a flat tire, and after running some rock, paper, scissors to decide who gets to change it, a woman in a wedding dress speeds past them, followed close behind by a car full of imposing henchmen. Jigen and Lupin jumping back into theirs and racing after them, as Lupin the Third's exhilarating theme finally rushes into the foreground as their tires dig in. Once the pair catches up to the game of vehicular cat and mouse they stumbled into, Jigen slyly asks which one they're helping, and when Lupin matter-of-factly replies the girl, Jigen simply responds typical, as he smiles and takes another drag from his cigarette, one of dozens that litter their homely little car. This is another example of the way Miyazaki handles characterization in this film, not just with the vivid movements and expressions of his characters, but the spaces between the lines they deliver. It must be a given that Lupin would save a person in need, particularly a woman, based on Jigen's reaction, yet Yet Jigen facetiously prods anyways, not because he wouldn't as well, but because he affects a comparatively much more aloof disposition to disguise that. Something that takes almost every other film or series in the canon at least 20 minutes to establish about who they are is expressed in its entirety in the exchange of just 7 words while they catch up to a chase. And what expresses even more is the car they're saying it in. One extremely important detail I neglected to mention earlier about Yasuo Otsuka and his involvement with Lupin the Third is that the entire reason he left Toei for a chance to work on it in the first place is because his 2 greatest obsessions on the planet besides animation itself were firearms and vehicles. And reasoning that Lupin owed much of its aesthetic framework to 007, a series known explicitly for both, he felt uniquely qualified to help in its construction. In his documentary Joy in Motion, he attributes falling in love with animation not to seeing a particular film or cartoon, but to watching a locomotive pass by him for the first time. As a kid, he regularly walked nearly 8 miles to town and back just to look at them parked in the train yard, filling sketchbooks with different engines and learning from the engineers how they worked, until he could explain every step of the process from memory. By the time he hit his teens, he had drawn books worth of trucks, cars, motorcycles, planes, anything mechanical that could propel movement to him represented a gateway to the world of wonder. A world he badly wanted to be a part of. Otsuka was so eager to learn how everything worked down to their smallest details that after he'd gotten a job as a test animator for Toei, he famously copied a Japanese translation of Preston Blair's cartoon animation by hand, image for image, word for word, into a sketchbook that he could keep for himself so he could memorize each page, as he did with virtually every other textbook he got his hands on. And this passion, not just for the mechanics of animation, but mechanics in general, was shared with Otsuka by a budding young animator he'd taken under his wing, Hayao Miyazaki. They would frequently talk for hours over their shared love of European cars and the magic of aviation, and this translated really directly not just into Otsuka's work, but Miyazaki's as well, to an extent that Otsuka's visual trademark of extremely complex mechanisms and archaic, eccentric vehicles became Miyazaki's in kind. So when Lupin the Third's life on screen began, so too did the tradition of making the world of Lupin the Third a moving museum exhibit, dedicated to automotive, locomotive, seafaring, and aviation history. In Part 1, Episode 1, Lupin appears in a Ferrari 312B. In Episode 2, Paisal the Magician drives a Messerschmitt Cabinet Roller KR200. Part 2, Episode 38, Fujiko pilots an Aerospatiale SA341 Gazelle. Part 2, Episode 99, a Renault 4L Torpedo Sinpar Plein Air Cabriolet. A car so unremarkable yet simultaneously rare that only a handful of them still exist. In Episode 145, one of the pair of episodes Miyazaki directed for Part 2, its villain Professor Lonebach restores a Kawanishi KX-3 flying boat and builds a nuclear arms factory inside of it, but the Kawanishi KX-3 was never even built in real life. Miyazaki and his team had to capture a flying machine, the way it turns, the way it sounds, the way its seats would feel, based solely on unfinished, declassified schematics from World War II, and it steals the entire show. The gang chase after it to save Fujiko, who had been taken captive and is fighting her way out from the inside, in a 2-seated training model of a Boeing P-26 pea shooter, which is so rare I literally couldn't find one. And it's maybe my favorite episode in the entire series. Part 3, Episode 39, a Renault 5 Turbo. Part 4, Episode 20, 1939 Fiat Topolino. The Woman Called Fujiko Mine, Episode 12, 1963 Rover P6. Part 5, Episode 10, Mercedes-Benz 300SL W198. Part 6, Episode 16, a Lotus Europa Special Type 74, painted in the livery of Lotus's 1972 F1 Championship team, one of only 200 ever produced. And this extends to the films as well. In Dead or Alive, Lupin drives a Porsche 356. In Lupin the First, we see a modified Blumenvoss BV-222 Viking and a Fairy Swordfish. I mean, the list is endless. Vehicles as they appear in the world of Lupin the Third aren't merely objects or tools, they're faithful recreations of some of the world's greatest works of art, and an extension of the characters themselves. And what they signify about their users expresses more about them than almost anything else in their universe. Hear me out. In the original pilot film that TMS produced, the narrator introduces Lupin sat in a 1928 Mercedes-Benz SSK, designed by Ferdinand Porsche and one of the rarest cars in the world, pointing out that it was a favorite of Hitler's before boasting its top speed in the supercharged straight six that powers it, while describing Lupin himself, inexorably linking his identity and how the audience is meant to perceive him to the vehicle he's driving. The SSK is Lupin the Third's primary car throughout Part 1, especially in the earlier episodes, and this is because it's it's our introduction to the sharp, uncaring, and voracious interpretation that Osumi and Mr. Kato had of him. But once Otsuka Takahata and Miyazaki take the reins, he begins to appear more frequently in a much less assuming car with a completely inverse design philosophy, to reflect his change to a considerably gentler disposition. A 1957 Fiat Nuova 500 in light blue, designed by Dante Giacosa, the very same Fiat 500 Yasuo Otsuka drove himself to the studio in every morning. Its body lines were smoother, more playful, the suspension geometry and low displacement from its two-cylinder engine made it weak in a straight line, but gave it an immense advantage in the corners along with its shorter wheelbase, and it could outmaneuver cars twice as powerful than it with relative ease. And in the castle of Cagliostro, that's exactly the Lupin the Third we get. Light and playful, but extremely capable in spite of that. The car they're driving in the chase, and the one they use as a second home throughout its runtime, is the same Fiat 500, except this time in a canary yellow. And it's this film's use of the little car that led to it becoming the single most iconic symbol of Lupin the Third's universe. As they fly down the mountainous roads of a sequestered kingdom facing the sea, swerving to dodge German hand grenades from World War II and defying gravity itself to soar up and down the sides of cliffs with beaming smiles across their faces, Otsuka Takahata and Miyazaki's vision of Lupin the Third from Part 1 is finally fully realized. And it's this incarnation, first perfected in the castle of Cagliostro, that nearly every other work in the canon harkens back to. See, the Castle of Cagliostro is what I like to call a swag definer within its canon, a definitive work against which all others are measured both in terms of quality and tone, like the Wrath of Khan for Star Trek, or Wrath of the Lich King for World of Warcraft, or Wrath of the Titans for bad movies. In essence, it is Lupin the Third's very own Goldfinger, and for almost every subsequent series and film, Lupin's characterization is either signified by the Fiat 500 or a very close approximation of it. In Part 3, Pink Jacket, easily the goofiest of all the series, they either whip a Mark II Mini or a Volkswagen 181, known better in the US as The Thing, both deeply unserious but spirited cars that define the tonal bedrock of their run. Part 4 and 5, Blue Jacket, they're back in the Fiat 500 or Renault R8 Gordini. Part 6, Green Jacket 2 Electric Boogaloo, we're back in the Fiat 500 again, until Lupin suffers a psychotic break at the hands of his old master and takes the SSK when he seemingly abandons the gang. In fact, the only argument I can think of against Lupin's characterization following the vehicle he appears in is that in Lupin the Third Part 2, most people say that he still drives the SSK, but that's wrong. It's not an SSK. It's a 1965 Alfa Romeo Grand Sport Quattrotte Zagato that everybody just thinks is an SSK. It has different vents, different aero, different emblems, different shifter, it's smaller, it's quicker in the bends, and it's much lighter. Just like Part 2 is. And this holds water in regards to Mamo as well. The Mystery of Mamo and the Castle of Cagliostro were intended to be a double feature, a co-op starter pack to the world of Lupin the Third that captures both extremes of its obverse identities. They're like the animated film equivalent of Ripto's Rampage and the Cortex Conspiracy, or buying a Merfolk vs. Goblin set to learn Magic the Gathering at your friend's kitchen counter. And while See on both sides like Chanel leans all the way into the Fiat 500 as a mechanical representation of Lupin and the gang, in The Mystery of Mamo, he drives a 1931 Mercedes-Benz SSKL, an even faster, more aggressive, specifically built for racing version of Part 1's, because the Lupin we're introduced to in it is 2. Mamo at one point tries to read his mind, projecting a mirror image of his subconscious against the wall of the chamber they're in, and it's nothing but uninterrupted sex and violence, as if Yoshikawa took a scene straight out of A Clockwork Orange and then transposed it to animation. He's more vicious, more selfish. A vague incisiveness lurks beneath every expression, and he's the closest we ever get to Mr. Kato's original Lupin on the big screen. So the car he's shown in reflects the extreme exaggeration of these qualities. And this contextualization of characters through the vehicles they choose extends to the rest of the main cast as well. Zenigata is an old-fashioned detective, a self-proclaimed man of principle, and is styled as forever being stuck in the era he's based on, wearing the outfit of a 1940s noir detective and often found brooding over a glass of scotch. So the cars and motorcycles he appears with are all callbacks to a bygone automotive era. In the Castle of Cagliostro, as well as nearly every other work in the series, he drives a Datsun Bluebird, specifically a 410 produced in 1963, designed by Pininfarina to resemble the Lancia Fulvia, named after an ancient Roman road. A car so suspended in time, you almost hear Dean Martin in its exhaust note. The prevailing motif of both parts 4 and 5 are how the main cast of Lupin the Third are heroes out of time, potentially unable or unwilling to adjust to a contemporary imaginary world and the restraints it may bring. And to reflect this, Zenigata stops driving almost entirely. The cars available to him abroad while he's homesick for Japan, both in a literal and a figurative sense, are simply too unfamiliar to his tastes. So he's nearly always chauffeured around instead, carrying his same old cuffs, only to return in his same old Bluebird at the beginning of part 6 to share a drink with Jigen and reassure him that there's still a place in the world for them. Fujiko, named after the summit of Mount Fuji itself, was created in the image of every Bond girl combined, synonymous with the expression of freedom, and to this end, she rides the mechanical equivalent of the word, being the main motorcyclist of the group and almost exclusively using them as opposed to cars throughout every film and series, often appearing on vintage Harley Davidsons like this 1946 EL Knucklehead, and various sport bikes like the Ducati 999 or Kawasaki's legendary GPZ 1000 RX. In the castle of Cagliostro, she rides a 1940 Indian Super Scout, with its military standard olive green repainted to a raspberry red. And the vehicles driven by our damsel in distress and the henchmen chasing her are of equal significance. After the pair fly down the other face of the mountain and Jigen lands a decisive blow with his revolver, the henchmen fall behind and swerve into the cliffside, their fiery crash bringing an end to our electrifying chase. But we quickly realize that there's a problem. The woman they just saved is asleep at the wheel. Lupin leaps to the other car and tries desperately to stop it before it soars off the edge with them both inside, but it's too late. As the car careens towards the waters below, Lupin manages to catch a tree branch with a grappling hook at the last second, and after breathing a short sigh of relief, turns to get his first good look at our film's main supporting character, Clarice. Yuji Ono's wistful chimes and string section underscoring her introduction until she wakes up. The branch snaps before they can reach the ground, and Lupin catches her fall, slipping into unconsciousness himself as she quickly soaks her gloves to help him, before a strange boat appears and she's forced to flee again, apologizing to him as she leaves. On its own, this is a fantastic introduction to her character. The range of emotions she goes through in the span of just a single minute, reacting to the height and then following their fall, is a really captivating way to illustrate her simultaneous inexperience and gentleness with very few words spoken, and removing her glove to help the rogue who had saved her serves as a visual reflection as to why a princess would seem to be running away in the first place, because there's something about this kingdom she'd rather shed herself of. The car she's introduced to us in while fleeing her pursuers is a 1949 Citroën 2CV Type A, the very same Citroën that Hayao Miyazaki drove himself to the studio in every day. You can tell it's a first generation because of the ripple bonnet on the top, but the car trailing her is older still. And whereas the Citroën 2CV is spiritually identical to the Fiat 500, sharing the same design philosophy of a cheap, light chassis with very little power but considerable dexterity in the corners, her assailants attempt to hunt her down in its polar opposite, a 1938 Humber Super Snipe. It's heavy, it's large, aggressive in a straight line, but terribly lacking in agility. And at the time of its relevance, it was synonymous with the upper rungs of society and government officials. That is, until World War II, when its production was repurposed as a troop-carrying vehicle, hence the vintage grenades. So Clarice is implicitly aligned with our dynamic duo the second she appears on screen, and the men flying after her reflect the conceptual antithesis of them. Foot soldiers carrying out the whims of someone with considerable money and power. But the money's been here for a very long time. Also, this boat that causes her to flee into the woods and finally captures her after their fall is based on the Turbinia, the world's first turbine-powered steamship built in 1894, easily the fastest ship in the world in its time, again underlining the impression that there's more to the humble duchy of Cagliostro than originally meets the eye. And this palpable sense of not just long-standing opulence, but dominance lies just beneath its surface, reflected in the contrast between the vehicles our characters use. Anyways, Clarice is ferried away and Lupin wakes up to a new ring like Steph Curry, and after realizing that he's seen this before, we cut back to him and Jigen speeding away in the now barely held together 500, before arriving at a castle ruin, emblazoned with the very same crest as the ring Clarice had left behind. They quickly run into a lonesome groundskeeper who mines its empty halls, and the pair learn from him that this was once the palace of Cagliostro's Grand Duke, effectively their king, but there was a fire some years ago and the duchy is now ruled by the Count instead, a distinct tinge of bitterness peeking through the old man's voice. Lupin wanders off, and we follow him throughout the vestiges of the palace, as another enchanting piece of Yuji Ono's score gently envelops the scene. But just as Lupin looks like he's about to break into a cover of Reflection from Mulan, Jigen catches up and quickly wrestles him from his nostalgic stupor and forces him to tell the truth about why they're really here. That Lupin had tried to steal the secret of the goat bills before, and that he'd failed. Enter the Count. Okay, so this part got copyright claimed, but just imagine there's a future verse playing right now. How are you doing? Being that the entire spirit of Lupin the Third is stealing things from the past and flipping them into something new, it should come as no surprise that Miyazaki and the castle of Cagliostro are not beyond influence. And this is most apparent in the character of the Count and the castle itself. The title of the film, as well as the name of the kingdom it takes place within, are taken straight out of the pages of Maurice Leblanc's very own 1925 novel, La Comtesse de Cagliostro, the Countess of Cagliostro. But it borrows very little else beyond some basic naming conventions. And Miyazaki instead finds its visual language and the rough outline for its plot in the foundations of another French work, Paul Clément's 1953 masterpiece, Le Roi l'Oiseau, The King and the Mockingbird, based on Hans Christian Andersen's fairy tale, The Shepherdess and the Chimney Sweep. In Clément's film, a miserable and heartless king, reviled by his subjects and careless to their whims, is in love with a painting of a beautiful shepherdess who hangs on a wall in his chambers, while her love, the chimney sweep, hangs upon the opposite. At night, the paintings and statues in his keep come to life, and the two lovers try to escape his terrible grasp, but the king tries to stop them. The pair nearly escape, but his villainous Grace captures them at the last moment, and threatens to kill the chimney sweep if the shepherdess does not marry him, only to betray her after she agrees and sentence the chimney sweep to imprisonment and certain death. The chimney sweep, with the help of his animal friends, ascends from the dark tunnels beneath the castle and, interrupting their wedding, saves the shepherdess and defeats the miserable king at the hands of his own kingdom's works. Except instead of a clock tower taking him out in The King of the Mockingbird, it's a weird French mobile suit. Regardless, this is roughly how the story of the castle of Cagliostro plays out. Lupin is the chimney sweep and remembers Clarice from the first time he broke into the castle to try and unravel the secret of the goat bills. Clarice is the shepherdess and falls in love with him after he promises to help her escape. The Count acts as the king and wishes to marry Clarice to reveal an ancient treasure which requires both of their families' rings to unlock. And Jigen, Goemon, Zenigata, and Fujiko are the chimney sweep's assorted friends who help him and the shepherdess dethrone the vile king. But because this is Lupin the Third and Miyazaki is at its helm, all of these fundamentally very basic classical roles within its story are given an exorbitant amount of depth, managing to capture the many interweaving character dynamics with a great deal of authenticity and warmth. Also, and this is a little convoluted, the version of the king that hunts them down in The King and the Mockingbird is actually a painting as well. He does away with the real king at pretty much the beginning of the story, so it doesn't actually change much, but it's important to note that the Duke of Cagliostro's questionable end and the Count's present rule over the kingdom aren't new additions either. The predominant change here is that both versions of the king in Clément's tale were basically the same guy, and nobody liked either, whereas our dearly departed Duke, as far as context can inform us, was a genuinely decent man, which elevates the Count's stature as the big bad even further. Good idea, Miyazaki, somebody should let this guy make another movie. This first shot of the Count of Cagliostro's castle, a dolly backwards to reveal its striking grandeur, framing it as an imposing monument, towering over the surrounding landscape below, is nearly one-to-one how Clément introduces the castle in The King and the Mockingbird, and to very similar effect. Its lower levels enshrouded in shadow, while its many spires and upper promenade are bathed in lush rays of sunlight. But Miyazaki does Clément one better, and completes the visual metaphor by introducing the Count flying overhead in the light as the boat that had recaptured Clarice, his prisoner, enters a hidden port at the base of the castle side in the dark. And although autogyros, the contraption we see the Count flying in on, are very much real, the one the Count flies isn't. The design is very loosely based off an S&Case SE700, a French prototype from World War II, but its proportions and cockpit have all been changed dramatically, and its propulsion now comes from a push configuration instead of the tractor it was produced with. In fact, this is the only non-existent fictionalized vehicle in the entire film, and it's piloted by our antagonist, who's meant to embody the very word deceit. The Count lands on a terrace outstretched from the castle's edge, and is greeted by his faithful servant, Jodo, as he explains how Clarice escaped and apologizes profusely for his carelessness, informing him that she's been returned to her prison and sedated. The Count's obstinate yet icy expression remaining completely unchanged throughout the entire conversation, even as Jodo helps him out of his flight suit and into his red jacket before he's dismissed, and the Count takes the hidden path to Clarice's chamber. As he slowly approaches her bed, he raises her limp hand to a ring nearly identical to hers and inversely colored, before realizing its opposite has seemingly vanished, quickly quelling his anger and gazing out the window at the small castle town below, where we cut to Lupin and Jigen in a tavern, studying the bluish-green crest that Clarice had left behind over a small table at the back. The Count is, in my opinion, one of the most fascinating and memorable villains in the entirety of the Lupin the Third canon, and I think this first scene illustrates precisely why that is, because the Count behaves in a way that almost none of the other popular villains really do. He's not outwardly murderous until basically the last act of the film, only raising his voice or resorting to personal violence well after he's been repeatedly thwarted. He's extremely calm and wears this vaguely amused, unflinching expression for almost the entirety of his screen time. We never learn anything about his past beyond our inference that he caused the fire which killed the Grand Duke, Clarice's father, and burnt down the palace. He has no special disdain for Lupin or his gang or Zenigata, and he never falters in his certainty that his plans will succeed, right up until the moment they don't. Mr. X, Mamo, Paisal, Kyosuke, Gerald, Enzo, Headhunter, Dr. Zell, Lupin villains, both new and old, are some of the richest and most diverse characters in animation. But they all tend to fit into the same vague amalgamation of behaviors, so they can more readily bounce off of the antics of Lupin and the gang. And these are as follows: extreme temperament, a vendetta against either Lupin, Jigen, Goemon, Fujiko, or Zenigata, a penchant for inordinate violence and cruelty, or unhinged delusions of grandeur. And the Count doesn't really fit any of them. Following Zenigata's arrival at the castle after hearing Lupin the Third had left a calling card exclaiming that he intends to steal something from Cagliostro, Johto is tricked by Lupin and falls through a trapdoor that they had originally set for him, and upon learning about it, the Count merely laughs it off and continues to explain what he'd like his henchmen to do next between chuckles. Ermin von Dite, in the pursuit of Harimau's treasure, rips her closest subordinate's tongue out with her teeth because they couldn't stop Lupin from stealing a statue. And it's this same relatively cool demeanor that the Count assumes that highlights and juxtaposes the extreme malevolence kept obscured by this act, painted not with his words or expressions, but the colors Miyazaki presents them with. Across nearly every scene the Count shares with Clarice, he continuously refers to this prophecy between their two families, the intertwined lineages of Cagliostro, and how, when the dark is reunited with the light, the ancient treasure of Cagliostro will be revealed. And this poetic symbolism of duality can be found all over the film. In fact, the first establishing shot of Cagliostro after the opening credits roll lays out the two sides of this conceptual conflict clear as day, in the standards of the two houses flying over the ancient portcullis Lupin and Jigen are about to enter. Clarice and her royal house are represented by the colors of white and blue, with the Counts represented by black and red. The reason Fujiko wears crimson to disguise herself as a castle's lady-in-waiting, the reason the vehicles from the keep are rich Chardonnay or Vermilion, are all because in the world of the castle of Cagliostro, this range of hues doesn't represent warmth or comfort, but fire and indignation. And everything the castle's shadow touches becomes enshrouded within it. The interior of the castle, whenever we're given a peek inside, feels like an incredibly ornate but foreboding acropolis, the constant presence of reds in frame accentuating the acute sense of impending danger. Not unlike Kubrick's use of the same color in Eyes Wide Shut, but just goofier. The only times cooler hues are ever prominent within the castle are in the places kept secret within it, like Clarice's chamber, the armory, and the dungeon sewer in its depths, all imbued with these deep purplish undertones, as if the conflict between red and blue, dark and light, is raging on in the environments themselves as the story plays out. And our heroes and the duchy itself couldn't be further opposite the castle and the Count. Clarice's white gown, as one could presume, is representative of innocence and gentleness, but Miyazaki's use of white throughout the film also embodies the tonal undercurrent of its tale: hope. A glint of optimism and the longing for a new day to dawn amidst the darkness. While Fujiko, Goemon, Jigen, Zenigata, and Lupin all serve as a visual ballast to the ardor lurking behind the castle's walls by reflecting the world outside of them. Blues, whites, yellows, browns, and greens. And the divergence between this gamut of reds and the rest of the color spectrum presented in the film is never more apparent than in the scene where the Count is about to be married to Clarice. A brief moment between them before they step into the church. Clarice, a prisoner of her own sedation, as the Count finally reveals his true colors. The algid magenta of his cloak pulled back to reveal an inferno kept hidden beneath. Speaking of Fujiko, here's Fujiko. Something Miyazaki has always done exceptionally well throughout the many stories he's told is create strong women to help push them forward. And I think the Castle of Cagliostro is a perfect example of this, both in regards to Fujiko and Clarice, although they each express these qualities in very different ways. Hayao Miyazaki's take on women in his work in general has always been founded in an especially deep admiration for tenacity and independence, balanced by extreme empathy. And this is almost entirely informed by his own mother, Yoshiko Miyazaki. When he he was just 6 years old, she was diagnosed with a form of spinal tuberculosis, which left her bedridden and frail for the rest of her life, oftentimes too sick to even hug her children. And this had an especially profound impact on Hayo, who was the closest with her out of her 4 boys. In spite of her poor health, though, she was extremely quick-witted and strong-willed, and no one in the house dared go against her. But this was harmonized by her immense capacity for care and warmth. And this presence can be found in every one of the films Hayo has made. Dula in Castle in the Sky, Yasuko in Totoro, Sophie in Howl's Moving Castle, Osano, Zaniba, Lady Eboshi, Nausicaa. Toki in Ponyo is easily the most literal projection of his mother in this childhood wish for her to be free as if by some kind of magic in any of his films. And Joe Hisayishi's composition for The Woman of Sunflower House, Where She Lives, was co-written by Hayo himself about her. It's not my time to go just yet, so please let me walk just for a while. Oh, how I'd love to dance once again, just like a gentle breeze. It was so personal that the first time he heard Joe Hisayishi's recording of it, he broke into tears and decided to not even keep it in the film. Point is, Hayao Miyazaki's canon isn't just filled with, but is led by, these poetic interpretations of his mother and what he dreamt she could do if she'd simply been given the chance. And what usually appears as one character who possesses all of her traits in his latter works appears as 2 who share them in Cagliostro. The strong-headedness and moxie of Fujiko and the exuberant kindness of Clarice. Like I said, the characters of Lupin the Third did not begin as we know them today. And it doesn't exactly take a detective to infer that Fujiko was in far and away the greatest need of development from the gang's inceptive appearances. And Hayao Miyazaki, go figure, is responsible for a ton of this growth as well. In the manga, Kato initially introduced Fujiko as a myriad of disconnected women who kept the same name and appearance because it was faster and cheaper than creating different Lupin girls for each chapter. And although she always possessed a lethal edge, this greatly limited her chances for a nuanced portrayal and how she interacted with her world and the characters within it. And Mr. Kato eventually realized this flaw as well, and folded her in as a regular member of the cast. By the time Lupin the Third Part 1 rolls around, we begin to catch glimpses of her in a more dynamic light. In episodes like A Hitman Sings the Blues, where Fujiko's old partner and love interest is killed by her own hand, but only to save Lupin, who just saved her. And in Part 2, this evolution is even more notable. Many of the stories begin to center around individual members of the gang, and her range of abilities and emotional depth grows considerably within a handful of these episodes. Like Tutankhamun's 3,000-year-old curse, where Fujiko is firmly in the driver's seat the entire time. But these instances were still few and far between, and it isn't until the Castle of Cagliostro that we really see this new conception of who Fujiko Mine is come to life. Fujiko first appears in the same sequence as the Count, posing as a court lady who serves Clarice, standing watch outside of her chamber. But we aren't given a proper introduction to her until a bit later, after Lupin and Jigen are followed home from the tavern and attacked by the Count's assassins, in one of the most intense and brilliantly animated fights in the entire series. Seriously, check out the weight expressed in the way Lupin and Jigen hold their weapons. Insane. Anyways, Fujiko's is, I think, my favorite introduction out of all the characters in the film, because it channels this extremely on-the-nose Scooby-Doo energy that permeates throughout the castle, complete with hidden bookshelf passages and eye holes cut into the paintings. And Yuji Ono's scores for the sequences where our characters sneak around it sound exactly like Ted Nichols' compositions that play throughout Scooby-Doo Where Are You as well. Come to think of it, there are a lot of similarities between Lupin the Third and Scooby-Doo. Maybe too many. Who am I kidding? It's not like they came out the same year. Well, okay, that's just a coincidence. I mean, they're nothing alike. Scooby-Doo is about a ragtag group of young people who the law thinks of as delinquents, wandering into extremely complex and outlandish criminal conspiracies, often veering into the realms of fantasy, science fiction, and the occult, and then overcoming the would-be villains through their use of exceptional yet niche and peculiar talents, with a countless number of follow-up series and films that make little attempt to maintain continuity or cohesion, including a CG animated soft reboot released to the US in 2020. And after its debut series, its main character switched from a green shirt to red. Wait. No. It can't be. No! Alright, I don't think I can handle another Scooby-Doo related existential crisis in my lifetime, so for the sake of brevity, let's just say the similarities in formula are a happy little accident, but a major contributing factor as to how the two series have managed to stay relevant throughout the ages, and we can just blow right past this. All I was trying to say was that, This sequence is really fun, because our introduction to Fujiko gets to be a spooky romp through a mysterious castle where she demonstrates herself to be an equally inquisitive thief to Lupin, while establishing that she knows exactly who Lupin is. And who he is not, because he is not Shaggy Rogers if he absorbed the abilities of the rest of Mystery Inc. through some kind of evil spell like Maxim Horvath in The Sorcerer's Apprentice. Soon after, all our characters convene on the castle, including Goemon, who appears immediately after Fujiko eavesdrops on the Count. Hi Goemon! We cut to the castle's armory in one of its lower chambers, opening with this, again, extremely Scooby-Doo multi-plane truck shot through a thicket of armored suits, which I won't read into at all. Fujiko's red disguise casts against the shadows like a match in the darkness as she comes into frame. Lupin sneaks up behind her, at first teasing her, before revealing that it's him, and they briefly catch up. Lupin being his playful, love-struck self, and Fujiko, ever the pragmatist, agreeing to tell Lupin where Clarice is being held on the condition he doesn't get in the way of her plan, stealing the exact same treasure that Lupin had set out for in the first place, the secret of the goat bells. Fujiko and Lupin have an extremely complicated relationship throughout the canon, being friends, enemies, lovers, partners, old flames, or a combination of all five depending on the series or film. And the only two constants necessary for this dynamic to work is that Fujiko always needs to play hard to get, while Lupin always needs to pursue her in spite of it. And in fact, Kato cites the embryonic inspiration for this dynamic in D'Artagnan and Milady de Winter from Alexandre Dumas' The Three Musketeers. Basically, they're capable of having feelings for other people, at least briefly, but their only true loves in this world are one another. And the strength of that love is directly tethered to the fact that their chase can never meaningfully end, even if they sometimes want it to. Having tried to be married, I think 5 or 6 times across the past 50 years. And writing this delicate balance convincingly, tenderly, is in my opinion the most difficult aspect of creating a truly great work within the Lupin canon to get right. And because of this difficulty, some of the less inspired interpretations of their dynamic in the earlier works relied on scapegoating Fujiko as a mostly unlikable, unkind narcissist whose Lupin's obsession with could only ever be understood by himself. And this scene, this brief reunification between them about 35 minutes in, absolutely blows the trite, often leaned on characterizations of her out of the water, expressing at once their lighthearted affection for one another, Fujiko's excitement that Lupin is still alive because he'd nearly died the last time he was here, and the sense that these two have known each other for what seems like a lifetime. And the following scene, which Fujiko appears in after Lupin leaps across the castle's rooftops to speak with Clarice and narrowly avoids his death at the hands of the Count, is an affirmation of every thread this conversation implicitly sows. Except in this one, she isn't speaking with Lupin, she's speaking about him to Clarice.
あの方をご存知なの？うんざりするほどね。時には味方、時には敵。恋人だったこともあったかな。彼生まれつきの女たらしを気をつけたの。捨てられたの？まさか捨てたの。
Little side note, this is also one of the only times Fujiko ever appears as a natural blonde in animation, besides The Secret of Twilight Gemini and Island of Assassins. But in the original promotional art for Part 2, she sometimes appears blonde as well, because Mr. Kato never actually decided what hair color she was supposed to have, since she was technically, initially, dozens of different women at once. Doesn't really have anything to do with the story, I just think it's kinda cool. Anyways, after realizing that for anyone else to escape the castle with their lives, she'll have to blow her cover, Fujiko steps into Clarice's chamber and reveals her identity as well, removing the dark crimson dress she had been wearing and uncovering the green camouflage jumpsuit she'd kept concealed underneath, exchanging potentially her only chance at the Cagliostro fortune to save the life of the man she loves, his remarkably strange partners, the inspector they're chased by, and a girl she barely even knows. Because in Miyazaki's Lupin, those are Fujiko's true colors. In the couple episodes of Part 2 that Miyazaki would later write and direct, under the pen name Teruki Tsutomu, he develops this depth of character even further, and Fujiko acts as the linchpin to both stories' resolutions. In Wings of Death Albatross, Fujiko is given a stunning 2-minute-long sequence where she breaks free from her own captivity and subsequently beats the brakes off an entire plane's worth of villainous soldiers before Lupin and the gang can even get there. And in Farewell My Beloved Lupin, the Part 2 series finale, Fujiko carries a similar responsibility to the one she bears in Cagliostro, recording proof of the crimes the gang have discovered, busting the real criminals, and helping Zenigata in the process, and once again saving Lupin, Jigen, Goemon, and an innocent red-haired girl with an abundance of kindness in her heart. It's in this episode that Miyazaki circles back to the motif that he'd begun with Clarice, evolving her into a young robotics expert named Maki Oyamada, the daughter of a slain scientist, who would then develop even further into Nausicaa herself. Piloting an early version of the robot Guardians he would later immortalize with Castle in the Sky, the first film Studio Ghibli ever produced, and all three voiced by the same actress, Sumi Shimamoto. What's more, not only are these the first 2 episodes of Lupin the Third to be released on VHS in Japan, these were also the first 2 episodes to be released in the US, originally as Tales of the Wolf, and a year later as a compilation tape called Lupin the Third's Greatest Capers. Check it out, I even own one. Miyazaki's characterization of Fujiko throughout Lupin the Third isn't just the way most of the world was introduced to the series, it's also the standard against which every subsequent work within it is measured. And the countless unique and vivid portrayals of her we've been given since then are at least partially owed to this resolute push against the Flanderization of one of the series' richest and most complex characters. And to balance Fujiko's bravery as it appears in her boldness, Miyazaki presents Clarice with a bravery of another kind. Every interaction between Clarice and a member of the gang is punctuated by a gesture of selflessness or graciousness. Whether it's her helping Lupin and apologizing to him after they fall, to trying to keep Fujiko safe as they attempt to escape, to making Jigen and Goemon promise they'll be careful during the climactic final battle of the film, Clarice is constantly doubling back into danger or staying in it longer than she should, explicitly to extend kindness to a group of miscreant thieves who undoubtedly seldom receive it. Clarice even spends more time facing off against our antagonist than Lupin does. And in keeping with Miyazaki's more broadly expressed philosophy throughout his many works, her kindness and her earnestness is never once portrayed as a weakness. In fact, it's anything but. After Lupin is trapped and sent to the depths of the castle by the Count, he assures Clarice that he's still alive, taunting the Count by revealing that the real ring is still with him, and the one he had placed back on Clarice's finger is a fake that he'd forged earlier, just before the assassins barged into his and Jigen's room. Lupin explores the makeshift catacombs, lined with the bodies of those who had ventured to uncover the castle of Cagliostro's secrets before him, before running into Zenigata, who'd fallen in as well. Zenigata yells at him for a moment, but then relents, realizing they'll need each other's help if they have any hope of escaping. And after disguising themselves as a pair of the Count's assassins who had been sent down after them, they swim to the dark heart of the castle and finally discover the source of the immense shadow it seems to cast. A counterfeiting room, piled high with notes from every nation you can imagine, closer to perfect than even the real things, through which the Count's family, hidden within the quaint duchy of Cagliostro, had been pulling the strings of the world stage for centuries. And in a masterstroke of poetic irony, Lupin and Zenigata set it all ablaze. After our diametric duo make their way to the top of the castle, they steal the Count's very much not real autogyro and fly to Clarice's chamber, back to where we left her and Fujiko just a moment ago. And the first dramatic twist of Clémence the King and the Mockingbird plays out right in front of us through Miyazaki's lens. Lupin is shot while reaching for the wheel of the autogyro to help Clarice and Fujiko escape, his body falling limp against the castle's steep roof as Clarice clambers down to its edge and stops him from falling, lying over him as his blood begins to pour off the side and yelling to Jodo and the Count that they'll have to kill her to harm him further. After testing her mettle and realizing she's telling the truth, the Count offers her a deal. Take the ring back and marry him like he'd planned, and Lupin, Zenigata, and the gang will be free to go. Clarice obviously accepts, against Lupin's weakened protests, and Fujiko helps her by telling her his favorite hiding spot, behind his collar. But then, just before Clarice can hand the ring to the Count, Zenigata soars back into frame in the now smoldering machine and crashes down the roof of the castle before flying away with Fujiko and Lupin hanging on to its side, as the Count orders Jodo to fire again, because of course, his offer was nothing but a lie. Fujiko glides away a la Terry McGinnis after making sure that Lupin can hold on, and Goemon and Jigen catch him in the Fiat 500 below, while Zenigata crashes into the forest beside them, yelling after the tiny car that Lupin can't die until he catches him. An affectionate desperation underscoring the determination in his voice. This is my favorite sequence in the entire film, and it's also the first moment all 7 members of our main cast get to share. The animation work here is genuinely nuts. The way Clarice's hair and clothes blow in the gusts of wind surging upwards from the lake below, the individual stones torn from the roof as Inagata rips down its side, Fujiko's delicate hold on Lupin and her softened, worried expression contrasting the sarcastic words she leaves him with, the intensity in his expression as he tries to stay alive as they fly away, and the explosion marking the climax of the scene, followed by his almost tranquil fall into the hands of his companions, is enough dynamic expression to spread across the entire duration of a lesser film. Yet this is only 3.5 minutes of Cagliostro, every second of which is absolutely magnetic. And the message it delivers is maybe the boldest Miyazaki ever underlines his worldview in any of his works. That kindness doesn't make us weak, but is instead the strongest form of bravery a person can know. After Lupin is taken away, he spends some time healing from his nearly fatal wound in the care of his gang and the old groundskeeper. And in another flashback, it's revealed that Clarice is the one who had saved him the first time he fell in Cagliostro as well. And in this flashback, his younger self drives the SSK. One of my favorite aspects of Lupin the Third as a series in general is the care taken in the way it handles the trope of found family. Essentially, a group of once lone characters coalescing by chance to form a surrogate kinship of fiercely loyal, often roguish companions, like Inuyasha or The Sopranos if it stopped halfway through. And Lupin the Third takes this to the next level. By constantly introducing these transient companions, most often young women who are mistreated by the worlds we find them in, who are both inducted into the family and become catalysts for growth within it, without ever actually becoming permanent additions, lifting the veil just enough for us to see beyond the pretense of this group of criminals who can never trust, to reveal the eager to welcome, eager to learn hearts they keep hidden beneath. Because our tenderly temerarious quintet extend their trust and care to others all the time. Ami, Iska, Becky, Diana, Letitia, Rebecca, Rosetta, Oleander, Asuka, Nyx, Maki, Misa, Maria, Utica, Lorenza. The list of characters who occupy this narrative space relative to the gang in Zenigata is functionally endless, and this is the same place that Clarice occupies within Cagliostro. Someone who isn't just elevated from the dire circumstances we meet them in, but who elevates the group in turn, allowing them a chance to become kinder and more gracious people than the ones they were before. Altruism and goodness are treated like an infectious disease within this universe, and the potency with which it spreads is never expressed more clearly than in the contrast between the Lupin we see in his past and the Lupin we're introduced to after Clarice had saved him in it. Which, now that I think about it, is maybe the castle of Cagliostro's most impressive feat of all, at least from a storytelling perspective. That Miyazaki manages to convey genuine mortal danger to Lupin the Third. Okay, bear with me. Lupin the Third, like any other canon on the planet, has a specific set of chronicled commandments that it must obey, so decreed by the main monk himself. And although they're a little nonsensical, rules are still rules, and every writer that's ever put their pen to the series has been sworn to obey them. There are 2. Rule number 1, the universe of Lupin the Third is boundless, only loosely stitched together by what we'll call negative continuity. Basically, there's no cosmic inertia to anything that happens on screen because it disappears the moment the credits roll. The castle of Cagliostro ends, everything in it stops existing. This no longer happened. Part 5 rolls around 39 years later, and Ichiro Okuichi thinks it would be fun if the gang hid out in the catacombs of the castle at the end of an episode. So Clarice de Cagliostro draws breath once more. But when the season comes to an end, so too does she. Back to the ether it all returns. Every series, every OVA, every special, every film is its own independent timeline incapable of being influenced by the events of any other unless a writer explicitly thinks it would be cool to do so. It's not supposed to make sense. Hence the references to Cagliostro as a film inside of another story's world, or Fujiko's background being a part of a duo of assassins in one series and an abused runaway clone in another. Goemon and the origin of his Zantetsuken changes basically every single time they're brought up. Is it a combination of 3 swords from the legendary swordsmiths Kotetsu, Yoshikane, and Masamune, or is it a meteorite from Africa? Depends on the world you ask him in. Essentially, the only things that change or evolve about the universe are in the abstract, the way that people write the characters themselves. Which brings us to rule number 2. Lupin and Zenigata, and by extension the rest of the gang, are never allowed to die. The interdependence of these two tenets are probably pretty immediately obvious. In an interview with the Tokyo Foundation in 2005, Mr. Kato said that the story of Lupin the Third can never truly end, even though he literally blew them all up on an island in the last chapter of his manga. Because in his words, I just got tired of drawing them, and if I had to really end it, Lupin and Zenigata would be equal. Both would fall or both would win. Or maybe they both just get very old. And therein lies the crux, because neither of them ever do. Just like Tom and Jerry, who Kato had modeled the cat and mouse nature of their relationship after, this dance that they're both a part of is uncompromising and everlasting. The chase can never end because for one of the gang to die, everyone else has to die with them. They don't just have to be killed, they have to stay dead as well. And that's almost impossible. So how do you make your audience fear the cold hand of death when your character is effectively a god? You paint them as one, and then you make that god bleed. When Lupin is finally shot, a brilliant light erupts from the impact, different from every other bullet that misses him before or after it. This is a visual motif found in a small handful of works throughout the canon, established in Cagliostro, and it distinguishes the main cast, including the villains, from the surrounding world of a given tale. These characters are not normal, and we're not supposed to feel like they are. The henchmen who'd originally pursued Clarice, modeled after the castle guards in The King of the Mockingbird, throw grenades and shoot their submachine guns at Lupin and Jigen to standard effect. A brief flash of flame and smoke, but when Jigen returns a volley of his own, it looks like something straight out of Dragon Ball Z. My man has a literal Gallic gun. We see this again in films like Dead or Alive, one of the only Lupin animations that Kazuhiko Kato ever directly worked on, where a beam of light pours out from General Headhunter's skull after the gang finally manages to put a single bullet between his eyes by throwing a knife at its firing pin. And again in Dragon of Doom, as Goemon cuts through a plane forged from the same material as Zentetsuken, mere seconds before a heat-seeking missile it had launched would have killed everyone in the group. Much like the Greek epics of Homer, within these works there's a demonstrable separation between the mortals who occupy most of the world and the few supernaturally capable borderline demigods we follow as they roam through it. In fact, Lupin himself is only a few whiskers short of straight up becoming another familiar trickster, Sun Wukong, the other implicit inspiration for his character, hence the face. In Part 2, Episode 67, Lupin's Journey to the West, the gang literally acts out a chapter from Journey to the West, traveling to a remote mountain kingdom ruled by two giants by the names of Kinkaku and Ginkaku, the gold-horned king and the silver-horned king, straight from the pages of Wu Shengen's 16th century epic. So across the entire run of Lupin the Third, there's only really been a few times ever where Lupin or Zenigata or the others in the gang are truly convincingly close to death, all coinciding with this motif of explosive beams of light functioning as extensions of the character's energies in a corporeal, tangible form, and all relying on the relative normalcy of their surroundings to counterweigh these almost mythical portrayals with a sense of realism. In Miyazaki's own words, it is bound to reality. The more we draw the ordinary people, the more the unusualness of our thief can stand out and shine. If we wander off and draw a preposterous world and people instead, the novelty will disappear. So when Lupin falls, he falls like Achilles. And it feels real. But of course, this can't be the end. And just as the series itself had done only a few years before, our gentleman thief survives what surely should have killed him. And it's with his reemergence from this deep slumber and his reflection upon his life having been saved by the kindness of those around him yet again, that the crescendo of the castle of Cagliostro is finally ready to begin. As Lupin is lying in bed to regain his strength, a newspaper clipping marking Clarice and the Count's impending wedding drifts through a small crack in the window of the groundskeeper's home, where he's been taken care of since the escape, signed with the cerise pink lips of Fujiko's kiss, an invitation to danger, her bike speeding off in the distance as the determined expression Lupin had worn at the beginning of the film now fully returns to his weathered face. Cut to the now deposed Zenigata, sulking at his desk hundreds of miles away after the UN had forced him to withdraw from the duchy for fear of revealing its secrets while he had zero evidence of them, and Fujiko alerts him of the date as well, tying the plot back together in a neat little bow so that every player knows their place. Transition to the following day, and we open back up on the road that our introductory chase took place on, now at a standstill and filled to the brim with curious attendants to the princess's wedding, their cars and buses piled high as they excitedly wait beside the road to get through. Jigen tricks the priest meant to officiate the wedding out of taking the main path, lying to him and his guards about a secret route to the castle, allowing Lupin to go in his place instead. After which, Jigen and Goemon sneak in from beneath, youth to crash the ceremony with a dummy of him, jeering the Count into having his assassins attack them in front of his guests and the cameras, which Fujiko snuck in with posing as a reporter. Right after the assassins stab the dummy, it explodes, raining down counterfeit bills over the ceremony and onto the shoulders of virtually everyone in attendance, as Lupin's echoing voice plays from a recording and explains to the people that the goat bills aren't just real, but that the Count's side of the family have been making them for centuries. The sight of the fake Lupin being stabbed shakes Clarice from her stupor, and after reassuring her that the real one is just fine, Lupin in his saintly disguise steals both of the rings right out from under the Count's nose, before setting off their final battle with a bang, as they escape through a window and Inspector Zenigata charges in with his police. The word crescendo originally comes from classical music, Italian, not used in English until the late 18th century, and it meant the gradual increase in loudness of the instruments during an orchestra's performance, although now it's used mostly as a synonym for climax, particularly those found in stories. And of the many countless artists who tell them through the world of film, Hayao Miyazaki has always been, to me, one of the most musical. I think this is why his works are always so much more deeply connected to the compositions used within them than many of his peers, because the films themselves flow in a way much more characteristic of music than anything else. Throughout his entire filmography, there's this intuitive sense of tension and release, of dynamics in the musical sense. And rather than structuring his adventures around one or perhaps two significant dramatic peaks, as many screenplays in the genre do, his works are instead comprised of a multitude of short bursts, each greater than the last, until their final movements are an almost deafening chorus of visuals and sounds. Think Princess Mononoke, the amount of brief glints of action buffered on either side by these stretches of relative quiet, and with each subsequent sequence, their intensity increases and the depth of the piece between them grows. This is a structure he establishes in The Castle of Cagliostro. Calm followed by restlessness, followed by calm, followed by restlessness, but in this progressively escalating rhythm, each rise in excitement reaching beyond the last, like a pendulum picking up more momentum with each swing. Basically, if the mystery of Mamo is Maurice Ravel's Bolero, then the Castle of Cagliostro is Haydn's Symphony No. 94, and each of its characters represents a different section of the orchestra as it plays. One of the many unique qualities of Lupin the Third as a series is that for the last half a century, it's really only ever had one consistent composer across all of its media, barring a few exceptions. This is like if John Williams scored over 40 movies in a single narrative universe in the amount of time that he scored 9. And it's allowed Yuji Ono the ability to not only develop a very complex musical language within the canon, but to iterate upon and nurture this language with every step it takes forward. And even in the small amount of time between the beginning of Part 2 and the premiere of our pair of films that TMS first produced, we can already see a great deal of evolution in the way the music in the series interacts with the story being told. Basically, since each member of the gang is a caricature based on a different set of tropes from Japanese and American culture throughout the early to mid-20th century, each of their essences is represented by a different group of instruments within Yuji Ono's compositions. I literally mean they are different sections of an orchestra. We already know Lupin is originally James Bond mixed with Arsène Lupin, but as he transitioned to the world of animation, writers began to fold in characteristics of the lovable rogues from the swashbuckling and crime genres as well, like Errol Flynn as Captain Blood and David Nivens as the Phantom from the Pink Panther. And as the enigmatic leader of the group, it's only fair that he'd be represented by the lead instruments which most often carry the melody of a given piece, particularly within these works. So flutes, saxophones, trombones, keys, vocals, and violins all became Lupin's musical domain. Fujiko is a Bond girl melded with the many iconic femme fatales of the past, such as Elsa Bannister from The Lady from Shanghai, Phyllis Dietrichson from Double Indemnity, and the Annie Laurie Starr from Gun Crazy. But she's also Lupin's opposite number, so she's musically characterized by instruments which aren't just culturally hardwired to represent women of mystery, but often accompany or directly contrast his. Harps, cellos, musical glasses, clarinets, pianos, and glockenspiels always mean the same thing. Fujiko Mine is on the scene. Goemon is a descendant of the Sengoku period folk hero Ishikawa Goemon, who is a Robin Hood-like figure that got boiled alive for trying to assassinate a warlord. And as such, he takes on the characteristics of numerous different folk hero-esque samurai from the Chanbara cinema of Japan. Think Zatoichi the Blind Swordsman, Sanjuro, and Miyamoto Musashi. Because of this, he's identified in the score by traditional Japanese instruments, namely shakuhachis, shinobus, ryotekis, and kotos. Jigen, on the other hand, represents the opposite extreme of this spectrum, being the only American in the group, but sharing a common foundation with Goemon, as Jigen was specifically based on James Coburn's character character Brit from The Magnificent Seven, who is himself based on Seiji Miyaguchi's character Kyuzo from Seven Samurai. Basically, he's the strong silent type, and this Marlboro-smoking, red-blooded son of the West has got the mannerisms of Clint Eastwood and the gunslinging of the Waco Kid, so he's represented by the most red dead-ass instruments there are: trumpets, harmonicas, acoustic guitars, and some good old-fashioned whistling. And finally, we have Zenigata, the sweetest little bear of the bunch, who is every bumbling yet gifted detective there ever was rolled into one. We're talking Inspector Lestrade, James Japp, Jacques Clouseau, the list goes on. And he's also based on an inspector who was the hero of numerous series and films set in the Edo period of Japan, produced in the 30s through the 60s, Zenigata Heiji, a policeman who catches criminals by throwing coins at them with deadly speed, hence the Zeni part of their names, meaning coin in Japanese. And the Jute Zenigata occasionally carries with him the traditional weapon of Edo period police, including in this final battle in Cagliostro. Pair this immaculate pedigree for comedy and action with a remarkable emotional depth, found more commonly in the leading men of the noirs and melodramas of the early 40s, which he's visually modeled after, particularly Humphrey Bogart in The Maltese Falcon and Casablanca, and we're left with arguably the most crucial musical role of them all. As the only real constant in the lives of our vagabond thieves, he's identified by the instruments that not only traditionally exclaim strokes of comedy, but those which keep the rest of the orchestra on beat: the drums, the cymbals, and the double bass. Equal parts serious and completely facetious, depending on the context of any given scene. And throughout the castle of Cagliostro, we can see how the music sort of talks to itself using these different identities to communicate its shifting tonality in the appearances of its characters. Like here, check out the way Yuji Ono introduces Zenigata and Lupin to each other in the catacombs before either of them say a word.
Lupin!
Cymbals and snares, then accompanied by flutes and strings. And when the gang come back together at the point we left them at, and the wedding erupts into an all-out brawl with them at its center, all of these individual musical identities coalesce into a variation on the main theme of the series, complete with Zenigata diegetically singing its chorus. Anyways, with the rings now in Lupin's possession, the gang splits off into their own duets, with Lupin and Clarice fleeing the castle, Jigen and Goemon staying behind to fight the assassins and cover their escape, and Fujiko and Zenigata commandeering the news cameras to reveal the printing room they'd set fire to earlier, putting the final nail in the coffin of the Count's legitimacy as the Count himself chases Lupin and Clarice to the massive ancient clock tower which stands across the lake, overlooking the castle and the lands that surround it. Lupin puts the two rings together and, with Clarice's help, deciphers the worn-down inscription along their side, revealing that the secret treasure of Cagliostro that the Count had been so cryptically referring to is unlocked at the peak of the very tower there stood directly beneath. And so our final duel between Lupin, Clarice, and himself takes place as they scale the treacherous clockwork housed within. Although the rooftop rescue is my personal favorite sequence in the film, I think this is its most visually striking, and it's also the one for which I think it deserves the most praise. The shifts in momentum as Clarice, Lupin, the Count, and his men leap between gears, constantly alternating directions as they scale the maze of interlinked sprockets and water wheels, narrowly avoiding being crushed at every turn, is at once anxiety-inducing and remarkably soothing to watch on a mechanical level. There's an almost fluid-like quality to the movement of the characters, in contrast to the solidness with which the cogs continue to turn, mirroring the poetic dichotomy of the series itself. These heroes, perpetually stuck out of time and seemingly cosmically defiant to its flow, scaling a grand monument erected in exaltation of its inevitable course. If ever I could summarize Lupin the Third with a shot, it would be this one. As the pair ascend further upwards, Lupin decides to leave Clarice on a ledge near the tower's peak, so that he can turn back and try to delay the approaching henchmen, but just as he does, the Count finally catches up to them. rising in a frame from the darkness below and thrusting towards Lupin, as the hero and villain of our tenuously contorted fairy tale finally face off against one another, exchanging glancing blows as they awkwardly struggle to stay atop the innumerous pieces of moving clockwork which surround them. And after dodging a swipe from the Count's sword, it's Lupin who initially falters, triggering a new set of gears and falling below the stage of their fight, narrowly avoiding death as he struggles out from between the tremendous machinery. Clarice climbs out onto the clock face to escape the Count, but the Count quickly follows, holding his sword to her neck as he explains that the Cagliostro bloodline will end with him alone. But just as he's about to kill her, Lupin reappears and offers a final bargain of his own, a direct reflection of our previous brush with death upon the castle's roof. Clarice's life for the secret of the treasure of Cagliostro, and the rings which hold them. And should the Count fail to agree, Lupin will have to kill him. The perspective work in this scene is insane. I don't think many people understand the sheer difficulty of making the medium and close shots we cut to throughout this appear natural, but the fact that Miyazaki's team was able to illustrate poses like these in motion without bringing any particular focus to them when the characters quite literally could not be stood on a slimmer margin for error is incredible. I feel like every second of this film there's something different to gush about, some other remarkable piece of what seems like magic that hadn't occurred to me on a first or second or even sixth watch. Like after the Count betrays their offer again, because of course he would, the way the camera contours around the clock hand here, and Lupin spins from his feet rather than his actual center of gravity, accentuating the force of the reaction itself, as if they're rotating the camera with the subject without actually rotating it. And these applications of fundamentally simple movements and techniques, executed with such precision that they appear much more complicated than they are, can be found all over the film. Also, this finale and the other nighttime sequences dotted throughout its runtime are absolutely gorgeous. Their colors, managing to remain so vibrant and lush in spite of how dark their settings are, lends these moments an almost dreamlike quality. And this is due to the fact that in the 4 short months the team had to make the film, they produced all of it on oversized cells and then shot them in a modified format of VistaVision that they nicknamed Anime Vision, so the film could be projected at a much higher level of brightness than usual and retain a significant amount more detail in its print, a technique employed in both Cagliostro and The Mystery of Mamo, further accentuating their already palpable bond as mirrors to one another's worlds. For every one detail or moment I've chosen to highlight, there's countless dozens more I wish I could, if not for trying to save at least a little bit of time. Clarice once again stops the Count from finishing Lupin off, throwing the both of them off the side of the tower in the process. And as they hang from his sword embedded deep within its stones, the Count kicks her down and sends her plummeting toward the lake that the ancient tower looms above, as Lupin sprints down its facade and leaps through the air to catch her, culminating in what is perhaps the single most iconic shot of the entire film, and leaving the Count above to climb back onto the ledge alone. And as he scales the clock tower's face and places the 2 rings into their grooves carved centuries ago to house them, the crescendo of the castle of Cagliostro plays its final notes, offering us one last monumental refrain. And following the cymbal crash of Lupin and Clarice plunging headfirst into the water below, the Count finds his fate sealed, just as the king in Glamour's tale had found his, at the hands of a monolith which represents the kingdom itself. And the great clock marks the end to our villain with the ringing of its bells as its hands strike midnight. Yet another ruler's flame extinguished by the unalterable passage of time. And with our story nearly approaching its end, the secret of the castle of Cagliostro, the real secret, is finally revealed. The treasure that the Count had so desperately been searching for, the treasure he had tried to kill so many to reach, never knowing what it was that he sought, had been right beneath him the entire time. Proof that someone else was here. Long, long ago. As Lupin and Clarice stroll through the preserved Roman city, the first time in the film the frame is dominated by Clarice's color, hope, while they're dwarfed beside the colossal works of marble surrounding them, Lupin says that this is a treasure for all of mankind, and not something that can be taken or kept to oneself. Not even by a master thief. And I think the same can be said for this film, and the series that it's introduced so many people to. Regardless of tone, regardless of style, of era, or director, or jacket color, Lupin the Third is a universe built upon and continuously driven by the idea that preserving and celebrating the works from our past, whether it be by reflection or incorporation or tribute, is worth it. And it's so infectious in this charge, so gleaming in its joy, and so singular in its execution of it that it feels impossible not to share it, or to restrain it behind conventional rules of continuity, or cohesion, or copyright. It's an ancient city crystallized at the bottom of a lake, or the unwavering summit of a mountain, dotted with flags from the countless artists who once climbed it. After all, Nebuchadnezzar wasn't the only king who buried letters under Babylon. Lupin the Third's impact shifted the tectonic plates of animation and helped change what people assumed were its limits, and the medium has continued to transform in the numerous aftershocks that have followed. Cowboy Bebop wouldn't exist without Lupin the Third. Spike Spiegel, Jet Black, and Faye Valentine are Lupin, Jigen, and Fujiko's characterizations from Part 1. Vicious is Goemon. The ageless antagonist from Episode 6, Sympathy for the Devil, is literally dressed up as Green Jacket Lupin, and Spike's ship, the Swordfish 2, is modeled after the gyrocopter from this movie. Mamoru Oshii was originally supposed to write and direct The Legend of the Gold of Babylon, but he was removed from the project because the screenplay was too outlandish, exploring concepts like discovering the fossil of an angel and a mad architect who tries to build a Tower of Babel in the heart of Tokyo. Ideas Oshii would later put to use in the development of Patlabor, Angel's Egg, and Ghost in the Shell. In the early 80s, French animation studio DIC were supposed to co-produce a spin-off series with TMS set in the distant future called Lupin the Eighth. But because Maurice Leblanc's estate requested an insane amount of money to distribute it in the West, they scrapped the project instead, and DIC retooled the assets into a series built around a design for Zenigata's descendant to recoup the costs. Inspector Gadget. The clock tower fight in Cagliostro is replicated almost bar for bar in The Great Mouse Detective, the film that gave newly hired Michael Eisner and Jeffrey Katzenberg the confidence to delay shutting down Walt Disney Animation altogether, and jump-started the Disney Renaissance, which in turn saved the studio. Hideo Kojima based Solid Snake off of Lupin's personality, and David Hayter would rise to fame, dubbing both of them. April O'Neil is modeled after Fujiko and Cagliostro and Farewell My Beloved Lupin. Professor Lonebach in Wings of Death Albatross was the inspiration for Dr. Eggman, and Lupin the Third's characters have made appearances across every generation of the medium. Macross, Urusei Yatsura, Fully Cooley, JoJo's Bizarre Adventure, Animaniacs, DuckTales, Lupe Fiasco's verse on Touch the Sky. If you translate the digicode on Oryxmon's neck, it spells out a quote from Cagliostro. Chunk even plays a rare laserdisc cabinet made from composite footage of Cagliostro in The Mystery of Momo called Cliffhanger in The Goonies. Oh hey, that sequence looks familiar, and maybe it's just because I've spent the last 8 months immersing myself in its world, but I can't help but feel like Lupin the Third still isn't beloved enough, still hasn't been given enough flowers for what it's accomplished, for what it's inspired. 8 months. As Lupin and Clarice are stood atop the hill beside the ancient ruins the Cagliostro had kept preserved, watching the Interpol troops drift quietly through the air as they parachute into the small duchy, Clarice begs Lupin to take her with him, to which Lupin replies, "Don't be ridiculous. You finally made it out into the sunlight. Haven't you?" I've been working on this video for half a year of my life now, and I'm starting to think the only reason I haven't finished it yet is that maybe I'm afraid to. Back in May, I told everybody that I was working on a new project, one that a lot of people had requested, and you'll never guess what it was about. Lupin the Third, the Castle of Cagliostro. I tweeted about it, I promised my patrons, I hyped it up to friends, everything YouTubers are supposed to do. But then, after I'd gotten started, I got sick. COVID. And I super thought I'd just brush it off if I got it, you know? Which I understand is just hubris on my part, but I was double vaxxed, chillin', still staying inside a lot, doing what a good gamer ought to. I thought, I definitely won't get it, but if I do, it'll probably suck for a couple days and then I'll go back to feeling fine. But that's not really what happened. I legit felt like I was gonna die the first couple days. Like, actually. I had the highest temperature I've ever had in my adult life, and my asthma was beating the absolute brakes off me. So it took all my breath just to laugh or to talk. So I sort of stopped doing a lot of either for a while. But it went away. Pretty average window of time, I think. My fever stopped after like a week and some change, and after 3, I could sleep normally again. I didn't feel all shivery all the time, but some things didn't go back to normal like that. I looked this up later, and I guess it's called long COVID, which, by the way, nobody could have come up with a better name. We couldn't call this shit like fox die or the scarlet rot or something. Anyways, all the muscles in my chest still hurt for the next month. Like, it hurt to pick things up, or to take breaths, or to sigh, or to stretch, or to yell. Speaking of which, my lung capacity was totally shot as well. If you've ever fractured your ribs because a scooter kid cut you off at the skate park, it sort of felt like that. And worst of all, I had this crazy, like, brain fog thing, and no matter what I did, I just couldn't shake it. For like 2.5 months after I got sick, I couldn't stay focused, I couldn't write, I sucked at taking notes, I would forget my point halfway through a paragraph, and in my personal life, I was mixing up people's flights, forgetting if I paid bills. I mean, I've always been a little all over the place, but this was different. It felt like I was indefinitely mentally jet-lagged and tired, but in this nebulous, intangible sort of a way that I couldn't pinpoint. I never felt like that in my entire life. And as stupid or weak as it probably sounds in retrospect, I was pretty scared. The prevailing piece of advice I'd heard was, as long as it doesn't get worse, just sit tight and bear with it. You're young, the hospitals are packed, it'll probably go away or whatever. So I just sat around by myself watching Lupin the Third all day, trying to write something down, anything at all, and hoping that tomorrow maybe I'll feel normal again. And after what felt like forever, I finally started to, thankfully. But my excitement that I didn't end up taking a lifetime debuff to breathing, or that I hadn't sustained a minor brain injury or something, quickly sunk into this immeasurable feeling of dread. Like a terrible, impending doom had just washed over me, because I realized I had nothing to show for it. The last handful of months I'd been gone. Like I owed people for me feeling sick, which feels stupid, but I did. I kind of did. This is my job. I love it, and it's a privilege, but I also need it to live, and it felt like I was just watching it wither in front of me as the sands began to sweep over top. Like I was asleep at the wheel, but I could still feel the car veering off the road. I couldn't hold up my end of the bargain, and that made me feel, guilty? I promised you something, and I ended up not being able to deliver it at the time. And my head was so full of snow that when it finally melted, whatever ideas I'd originally had for this had melted away with it. So, if you're wondering where I've been trying to make it right. Deleted everything I had and started the project over again. It's New Year's now? This is probably the 12th time I've rewritten this at this point. I don't know. I lost track.
What sense does that make? Think about it. The nature of a book is communicating something, and we would think we would communicate it to some reader. But this is not going to be published. It's written to himself. What makes a man write a book to himself?
322 episodes, 404 including the Part 2 dub, 27 specials, 9 OVAs, 14 movies, a musical, countless interviews, documentaries, 2 autobiographies, and a nearly endless list of associated works later, I'm still worried that you're gonna figure out that I'm stupid, an imposter, that I don't know how to make stuff anymore or never could to begin with, that everything before this was just a fluke. But that reality can't exist until I finish it. So I just haven't been. It's just the expectations of whatever this was supposed to be became so insurmountable in my own head. There's nothing I could make that would justify half a year of work or anticipation, but I swear I've spent so much of it trying. I've always assigned my value to whatever ability I have to entertain others or to make things that do, because I've never felt like I have much myself. It's just me, the person. So when I retreat from making things, I retreat in my personal life as well, only coming around when I have something new to show, because I'm worried if I don't, people I really like will get tired of me. I've spent months now ducking messages, ignoring sponsors, because I've just been chipping away at this never-ending video that is ever more likely gonna get sealed away in a vault somewhere like the Ark of the Covenant or the Noid after that guy took those Domino's employees hostage in the 80s. So I just keep throwing myself at it. This wall, you know, and questioning if it's even worth it. What if like diehard Lupin the Third fans don't like that I pronounce the name Lupin instead of Lupin or Rupin because I watched the Funimation dubs when I was younger? Or think that I'm not a real fan because I didn't mention the live-action film from 1974, or assume just because I cut a piece of information out of the script so it flows better, that means I simply never learned it, you know? I know that Hayao Miyazaki was only made director of Cagliostro as a favor to Yasuo Otsuka for helping him on Future Boy Conan. I do. It's just a cumbersome piece of information to stick somewhere. I've put as much of myself into this as I can, and I still feel like it isn't enough. Like I'm playing a trick on you, or like I need to defend myself against this made-up person who's just a combination of every negative comment I've ever gotten, when they probably would have found a reason to dislike it anyways. I'm not very good at processing change, or the prospect of it. It's something I've always struggled with, and I think that's why the more time I spent with Lupin the Third, the more it became a source of comfort for me in spite of how stressed I felt about it. This world that is at once in a constant state of flux, and yet never has to change at all. I find peace in things I can make knowable. I've always coped with anxiety that way, and making videos has given me an outlet for it, finding subjects to sink into and then trying to learn everything there is to know about them. And now, I know every frame of Cagliostro. Goemon is actually in the opening of the film before he's reintroduced in his entrance to the duchy. His head pokes out in the back of the Fiat 500 in the shot. The planes that fly overhead during the ending sequence are post-World War II era twin tails, Fairchild C-119s, also known as flying boxcars. During the car chase at the beginning of the film, Clarice's license plate changes values between cuts, F-73, F-14, then back to F-73. Lupin undoes a bolt by turning it clockwise instead of counterclockwise during the tower fight. And Richard Epcar was miscredited as Goemon on the original anime dub when he was actually played by Michael Gregory. But I have to finish this. Eventually. Right? But then it'll be out of my hands, and I have to just move on. And if it sucks, then people will think I spent all this time on nothing. And then I'll feel like that too, but I can't stay here any longer. So I'm done. This is my final draft, and if it turns out that it's mid, then I'm sorry, I guess. But I need you to know that I tried to make it back out into the sunlight. I should have finished this a long time ago. Lupin the Third is my favorite animated series of all time, and not just because it gave me a lot of warmth when my world was feeling a little cold. It's fantastic. Genuinely, all of it. I implore you, if you take anything away from this at all, please let it be that the Castle of Cagliostro isn't a solitary masterpiece, but a masterpiece among masterpieces. The Mystery of Mamo is breathtaking. You should watch it. Part 1 is one of the primordial building blocks of what we think of as anime today and deserves a ton of respect. And Part 2 is genuinely infinitely rewatchable. Seriously, it kind of is Japanese Scooby-Doo with guns. I've probably watched it all the way through at least 10 times, and that was before I had an insanely long video to write about it. Part 3 and The Woman Called Fujiko Mine are some of the most tonally dissonant entries in a fictional universe I've ever seen, but they're both brilliant all the same. Part 4 and 5 are, for my money, one of the best runs of anime in the past decade. Every character is lovable, every episode is electric. Island of Assassins is just cool. Lupin the First is like the greatest hits album ever constructed, and Princess of the Breeze is the most Miyazaki, non-Miyazaki Lupin film ever made, complete with pirates and cool airships. Prison of the Past, Crisis in Tokyo, Jigen's Gravestone, and Dead or Alive are just genuinely wonderful action films, irrespective of if their audience has any knowledge of the series. And Part 6 has a better written Sherlock Holmes story than the past 5 adaptations of the character I've tried to watch, and he's not even the main character of it. I love it, and I'm genuinely thankful to Miyazaki and everyone else who worked on Cagliostro for giving me a glimpse all those years ago into this world that I've now spent so much time in, even if I might have overstayed my welcome slightly. Miyazaki once said, "There is no unchangeable or untouchable image of Lupin the Third which we are bound to. It can take anything. We can throw anything at it. It encompasses everything. If there have been 100 people at its helm, 100 different Lupins exist as well." And I think that's why The Castle of Cagliostro is such a perfect movie to me. Not because I think it's been constructed without flaw, or that it's the only true way to write Lupin or something stupid like that, but because Miyazaki's Lupin is a perfect introduction to the other 99. A story that began with paintings that had come to life, made into a film in which every frame looks like one. A gateway to the world of wonder, unfettered by the passage of time and raised high with pieces from the many opuses that came before it. I think that's why this sequence, as it comes to its end, has always felt so striking in the context of the body of work to which it belongs. An ancient treasure of venerable stone, a monument suspended in time, preserved for the world to see by the many keepers who had come to rule it. But along with it, a reminder that even our greatest works must someday be reclaimed by time's inevitable passage. A tremendous wave, washing the past of the castle of Cagliostro clean, so that the next steward to take up its charge may rebuild with whatever is left behind. Almost everyone involved with that original run of Lupin that would go on to give two of the greatest directors in living memory their start and light a fire within the medium of animation that continues to burn bright to this day, sadly, aren't here anymore. Kazuhiko Kato, Yasuo Otsuka, Isao Takahata, Atsushi Yamatoya, Yasuo Yamada, Kiyoshi Kobayashi, Chika Otsuka, Goro Naya, and eventually, as much as it pains me to admit it, there's going to come a day where Hayao Miyazaki won't be either. But a piece of him, of all of them, will continue to live on in the stories that they've inspired. Just as Rochambeau and A.J. Raffles and Arsène Lupin and The Phantom and James Bond have lived on within their own. Even if their names someday fade from memory, even if their countless creations have all fallen back into the sea, somewhere in the works that have yet to come and in the foundations left behind, lies proof that they were here, in one of the greatest animated canons the world has ever known. Lupin the Third. As Goemon and Jigen pull up behind him, Lupin says his goodbyes, and as they drive off into the distance, Fujiko and Zenigata aren't far behind. And the castle of Cagliostro reaches its end the same way that it began, as a glimpse into a world of sound and light where anything and everything is possible. A world where the past lives on in our characters' excitement for what's still yet to come. Maybe the true meaning of legacy was never a castle on the water or a great city in the desert beside it, but an optimistic letter to the future buried in the foundations beneath. Have a good night.
Sorry it took me so long to write you back. I had to pull some people out of a burning building this morning.
You've got to see this. Get off the computer, come in here.
Well then, on with the show.
Y'all thick like a dog K9 that's generated. Developing the new theory around the
Calm as possible, make the deal go through. It's not 12 shots, we know how you do.
Well, I guess the batteries are finally running low, huh?
No, he's being lazy is what he's doing.
Hey, just see a ghost pass through here, cause I'm really hoping like hell that he's gone.
He probably went to the store to get some more food for his demons.
Who is the drizzle?
Yeah, who is he?
Who's you? You're the drizzle.
Oh, I wish. He wanted you to have these special drizzle phones. They connect directly to the man himself when you need his super help.
Yes, how do I call Japan? I just gotta do on my phone.
No international call. Drizzle's local.
I'm going back to my room, okay?
I'm calling Japan.
Who the hell do you know in Japan? Nobody.
Hello, Japan?
No.
Yes, can I meet you, Godzilla, please?
He's raining it out again. He's always a step ahead.
What did you want me to do a search for?
Okay, give me search for super crime, and then after that, the Drizzle expects you to walk on your own, you know.
When will you be back?
That's really up to God now, isn't it? He works through me. No one touches any of my stuff.
What did you say to him?
Listen, you hear that? That's the sound of him not being here. All right, you thank me later.
The king of love was my name. I always won at every game, girl. But I've had my share
Hey, thanks for watching. Big, big, big shout outs to my patrons, especially these guys, and a very special thank you to Tobias Egold, Miskabon, Bob Saget, Nicholas Esposito, Aurora Fatalis, Luis Concado, Altrix Wrights, Cypress Husky, Christian Carlos, Patrick Nolan, Decadently Decayed, Stromboli Bones, Jorge Miramontes, Dylan, Doombun, Omega Lol Error, Infernal, Callista Alice, Charlemagne Clemens, Jason Tyranny, Cagliostro Video, Ryan Donoho, Danny Franklin, Me Dude, Blood Edge 108, Dunkle Dubs, Atif Zaman, Maxfield Anderson, Falkus, Evan Kimball, Hari Patton, Nini, Eric Abrams, Josh Haney, Mitch Makarat, Matthew Rodridge, Edgy1700, Mini Tantrum, Ben Samuels, DK Combo, King Deadpoolio, Alexander the Barely Average, Blexy Ninja, Henrik Johan, Little Lordling, Alex Callan, Dr. Maushin, Walter Shepard, Blue Zhang, His Royal Nebs, Fred Sakai, Best Stressed, Brett Alfred, Daltimus Prime, Josef Fjeldseth, Mark Kent, Daniel Cadwell, Windex, Anonymous, Jeremy Wolfgang, Basugasu Bakuhatsu Bakumatsu, Dennis, Phoenix, Lloyd Weldy, Gamena, Jonas Shetler, Hunter Bernard, Yonderboy, Gerhard Ackerman, Jaden Gilmore, if you're reading this, you're cute, Luke Blevins, Josh Milburn, Tyler Bloom, Horace Hooper, Daniel Richardson, Ignacio Cowles, Izzy Lido, Loxon LD, Hugh Kennedy, Garrett on LSD, Micro Symphony, Carson Wall, Twilight Researcher, Joe Kenner, For the Horde, Zarya, Bushido Boy, Nick Baldy, Jack Barber Ormerod, Nico Hatch, Felix, Leander Schmidt, Enrique Nieto, Jojo, Jason Scott, Luke Jenkins, Patches, Artolian, Night Knight, Blade Lord Yuta, Nicholas Bloom, Christoph Taylor, Ghostly Birds, McKenna Gradient, Solomon Bell, Almighty Dwarf, Raphael De Silva, Chance Thrash, Disembodied Lego Head, Aiden Sales, William Brulon, Danyon D, Jake Pitch, Fox Hunt, Fog Knight, Peyton Williams, That One French Guy, Nicholas Lewis, No Take Candle, SSGT Snuggles, Solo Gantz, Scribe Scribbles, Albert Lee, Clunt, Gompy, Neonstalgia, Tyler Eaton, Ethan Boyd, Yuri Voice, Tyra Rogers, Ramlik O'Grady, Dante Cantone, Luke Hudson, Alex Fenn, Hascott, Ivan Dolvich from Jagged Alliance 2, Buttershield, Arkwing, Kane King, Louis, Alfiex, Ryan Boonstra, Mohamed El Zafri, Avid, Kyber, Straffen Nathan, Robin Amini, Tristan Marino, Joshua Kodomol, Blake Dimby, Ho Shen, Mumblecore Max, and Yo Lane. Without your guys' support, I wouldn't be able to do this, and I'm extremely, extremely grateful for that. Thank you.